It was a small book, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, small enough to slip inside a coat pocket, small enough to disappear without sound into the black water of the North Atlantic. It was printed in 1598, 4 centuries old by the spring of 1912, a second edition of Francis Bacon's essays, compact, elegant, bound in leather worn smooth by time, the kind of object that survives revolutions, fires and dynasties, the kind of object meant to outlive its owner. A 27-year-old collector named Harry Elkins Widener carried it aboard the most famous ship ever built. He had purchased it in London only days earlier. He had paid £260 for it, a serious sum even for a wealthy American. Other books he shipped home in protective trunks. This one he kept with him. It was too precious to trust to the hold. As he prepared to sail, he joked with a friend. If the ship went down, at least he would have something to read. The ship was the RMS Titanic. On April 10th, 1912, it departed Southampton on its maiden voyage. The largest moving object ever constructed by human hands, 882 feet long, 46,000 tons of steel and confidence, electric elevators, Turkish baths, a grand staircase crowned with glass and iron like something from a cathedral. It was called unsinkable. Not officially, but often enough that the word clung to it. Harry did not travel alone. His father, George Dunton Widener, accompanied him. So did his mother, Eleanor Elkins Widener. They were among the wealthiest passengers aboard. Their suite on sea deck connected adjoining cabins. A valet and maid attended to them. They were returning from Europe, where business and pleasure had blended easily. Paris, London, auctions, galleries, bookshops heavy with dust and centuries. Behind Harry's quiet manner stood a dynasty. His grandfather, Peter Arrol Brown Widener, had helped finance the shipping empire that owned the Titanic. Through the International Mercantile Marine Company, he held an interest in the White Star Line. He had made his fortune in streetcars, in consolidation, in the ruthless mathematics of movement. By 1912, he was counted among the richest men in America. He owned a mansion outside Philadelphia with 110 rooms, marble halls, bronze staircases, paintings by Rembrandt and Raphael hanging beneath carefully diffused skylight. A house built not merely to shelter, but to declare permanence. The Widener name carried weight in banking rooms and drawing rooms alike, and now 2 generations of that name were crossing the Atlantic aboard a ship their fortune had helped empower. The first days passed in comfort. The sea lay flat, the sky clear. First-class society unfolded with ritual elegance. Formal dinners, polished silver, conversations drifting between finance and art. On Sunday evening, April 14th, George and Eleanor hosted a dinner in the first-class restaurant in honour of Captain Edward John Smith. It was to be his final voyage before retirement. The captain, seasoned and composed, presided over the most modern ship afloat. Crystal glasses caught the light. Courses arrived in procession. Music floated upward from below deck. Outside, the ocean darkened. Shortly before midnight, the temperature had dropped sharply. The water below hovered near freezing. The sea remained uncannily calm, a sheet of black glass without waves to break its surface. At 11:40 p.m., the lookout spotted ice directly ahead. The impact did not feel catastrophic. A vibration, a long shudder like distant thunder underfoot, many passengers barely noticed. Below the waterline, steel plates had opened. Water entered 6 compartments. The calculations began almost immediately. The ship could float with 4 flooded compartments, not 6. Time shortened. On the boat deck, confusion met disbelief. Lifeboats were uncovered. Some passengers laughed nervously. Others refused to leave the warm interior for wooden boats hanging over darkness. Women and children first. Eleanor Widener stepped toward lifeboat number 4. Her husband and son stood beside her. It took time to load the boat. Windows had to be opened along the enclosed promenade. Minutes passed. The bow sank lower. The tilt became perceptible. George and Harry helped Eleanor into the lifeboat. Then they stepped back. Witnesses later recalled that a friend urged Harry to find space in another boat. There was still time. Harry declined. He would remain with his father. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic broke apart and vanished beneath the surface. More than 1,500 people died in the darkness. The lifeboats floated in freezing silence, listening to sounds that would fade into nothing. The little Bacon volume went down with the ship, Whether Harry carried it in his pocket to the very end, no one can say with certainty, but it never resurfaced. No salvage, no recovery, no body. On the morning of April 16th, a telegram arrived at Linwood Hall in Pennsylvania. Peter Arrol Brown Widener read the words that confirmed what the world already knew. His son was dead. His grandson was dead. Their bodies would never be returned. The mansion built to symbolize endurance felt suddenly enormous and hollow. But this is not only a story about a sinking ship. It is a story about what one family did afterward. They answered the sea with stone. They answered loss with libraries. They answered silence with art given to a nation. Before the Titanic, before Harvard's largest library, before the masterpieces in Washington, there was a boy in Philadelphia learning to cut meat in his brother's shop. That is where the story truly begins. Long before marble galleries and transatlantic steamships, there was a narrow street in Philadelphia. Not the Philadelphia of grand merchant houses and wide boulevards, but the other one. The one pressed tightly between brick walls blackened by coal smoke. The one where families lived above their work, where language shifted from English to German in the span of a doorway, and where ambition often had no room to breathe. Peter Arrol Brown Widener was born on November 13th, 1834, into that world. His father laid bricks. His mother kept house. The family traced its roots to German immigrants who had arrived in America seeking stability and found instead the slow grind of survival. They were not destitute, but neither were they secure. Work determined everything. Illness could undo years of effort. A single failed season could mean debt. Philadelphia in the 1840s was a city divided not just by wealth, but by rhythm. On Chestnut Street, merchants traded imported fabrics and fine goods. Carriages rolled past polished storefronts. Gentlemen in tailored coats spoke of shipping routes and rail expansion. Only a few streets away, the air thickened with the smell of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and factory smoke. Children learned trades before they learned grammar. Labour was not a choice, it was inheritance. Peter grew up on that side of the line. He was observant, though no one yet would have called him strategic. He watched how money moved through the city. He noticed who owned property and who rented it. He saw how connections, church ties, political affiliations, family alliances, mattered as much as skill. At 13, he apprenticed in his older brother's butcher shop. The work began before dawn. Carcasses arrived heavy and cold. Knives had to be sharpened with care. The floor washed repeatedly to keep away the smell of a rot. It was physical labour, but it was also arithmetic. Weights, prices, margins. Peter learned quickly. He learned how to judge supply against demand. He learned which customers paid promptly and which needed credit extended quietly. He learned that a counter could become more than a place of exchange. It could become a place of conversation. Men lingered after their purchases. They discussed elections, contracts, rumours of expansion westward. They argued about tariffs and railroads and the new industrial age pressing against old trades. Peter listened. By his late teens, the butcher's shop had become his education in power. Not theoretical power, but the kind that circulates through neighbourhoods. The kind that determines which families rise and which remain fixed. He saved money carefully. He avoided display. By his early 20s, he opened a modest shop of his own in a local market. Nothing grand, only a counter, hooks, scales, and steady work. But he had already begun to think beyond meat. He saw that cities were growing, factories were expanding, workers were moving daily across greater distances. The rhythms of Philadelphia were changing from foot traffic to wheels. The Civil War would accelerate everything. When conflict erupted in 1861, Philadelphia transformed almost overnight. Union troops passed through in columns, hospitals multiplied, supply chains strained under demand, soldiers needed food, the government needed reliable contractors. Peter bid to supply mutton to Union forces within 10 miles of the city. He won the contract. The butcher who had once scrubbed blood from a wooden floor now managed shipments measured not in pounds but in tons. Logistics replaced counter sales. Coordination replaced conversation. The war was brutal for the nation. For Peter Widener, it was transformative. He accumulated capital, serious capital, for the first time in his life. By the end of the conflict, he had saved tens of thousands of dollars, enough to shift his identity from tradesman to investor. But more important than money was what he had learned. Scale meant leverage. Leverage meant influence. And influence, properly used, could outlast any single trade. Philadelphia, rebuilding and expanding after the war, presented opportunity everywhere. Streetcars rattled through neighborhoods, drawn by horses, each line operated by small companies, competing inefficiently for territory. Peter watched them the way he once watched customers. Movement was money. Control movement and you control the city. The butcher's knife would soon be replaced by something sharper, consolidation. He would not remain a neighborhood businessman for long. In a few short years, he would enter politics. He would sit at the center of municipal finance. He would meet men who thought not in storefronts, but in systems. But in the 1840s and 1850s, none of that was visible. There was only a boy in an apron standing in cold morning air, learning to cut precisely, to calculate quietly, and to observe everything. The marble halls of Linwood were decades away, for now the future empire began with blood on the floor and a ledger balanced by hand. Before he controlled rail lines, before he advised bankers, before his name appeared in financial columns, Peter Arrol Brown Widener stood behind a wooden counter with a knife in his hand. The butcher's shop was narrow and dimly lit. Sunlight entered reluctantly through the front window, filtered by dust and the faint condensation of breath in winter. Hooks lined the back wall. Carcasses hung in quiet suspension, swaying slightly each time the door opened. The work was repetitive but never careless. A dull blade meant waste. Waste meant loss. Loss meant failure. Peter learned to sharpen steel until it could separate muscle from bone in a single deliberate motion. He learned to read weight by feel alone. He learned how much fat a household could afford, how much bone a cook would tolerate. Precision was not elegance, it was survival. The mornings began before dawn. Deliveries arrived in wagons that creaked under their burden. The smell of livestock lingered in the air long before the first customer appeared. Ice had to be hauled and packed carefully to slow decay. The floor washed again and again, and yet the shop was more than a place of labour. It was a meeting ground. Men from nearby blocks gathered there not only for their weekly purchases, but for conversation. Politics travelled faster than meat. News passed from mouth to mouth. Talk of city contracts, whispers of elections, rumours of new rail expansions. Peter did more than serve them. He listened. He remembered names. He extended credit discreetly when times were tight. He asked about wives and sons. He learned which families were rising and which were struggling. Without realising it, he was building a network. The butcher's counter became a platform. Influence did not arrive in speeches. It formed in familiarity. In a neighbourhood where trust determined business, Peter became trusted. By his mid-20s, he had opened his own stall in a public market. It was modest. A scale, a few polished surfaces, carefully arranged cuts displayed with intention. But the stall was his. Every transaction now strengthened his position. He did not drink heavily. He did not gamble. He saved. He watched the city expand. Horse-drawn streetcars rattled along iron tracks laid into cobblestone. Each line belonged to a different operator. Each operator guarded its route fiercely. Transfers were inconvenient. Schedules unreliable. The system felt fragmented, improvised. Peter noticed inefficiency the way he once noticed wasted fat on a carcass. Fragmentation meant opportunity. But before opportunity came respectability. In 1867, the Republican Party placed him on the Philadelphia Board of Education. He was 32 years old, young but already known. The butcher who spoke confidently about civic order and responsibility. The businessman who paid his debts and kept his accounts clean. The position paid little. That was not the point. It placed him inside the machinery of governance. He observed how contracts were awarded, how alliances were formed, how votes were negotiated. He learned that city politics functioned not through ideology alone, but through relationships, and that relationships could be cultivated like customers. He was no longer just cutting meat. He was cutting deals. The Civil War had expanded his operations. Politics expanded his perspective. He began to think beyond the limits of trade. He had seen what large contracts could yield. He had felt what scale could generate. But he also understood something deeper. Control of infrastructure mattered more than supply. Food fed soldiers. Transportation moved cities. and cities in the late 19th century were accelerating. Factories multiplied, workers travelled farther from home to employment, the need for coordinated movement intensified, horse-drawn streetcars, unreliable and scattered, were straining under growth. Peter had learned to break down an animal into its parts, to reorganize it efficiently, to extract maximum value. Soon he would apply the same logic to transportation, but for now he remained the disciplined apprentice. Steady hands, sharp blade, clear eyes. Ambition had not yet turned into empire. It had only begun to sharpen. The Civil War did not begin in Philadelphia, but it transformed the city. Troops moved through its stations in steady columns, warehouses filled with uniforms, rifles, blankets, and medical supplies. Hospitals expanded into churches, schools, and temporary structures that rose almost overnight. The rhythm of the city shifted from commerce to mobilization. War is destruction at the front, but behind the front it is logistics. Armies must eat. Peter Widener understood that before many others did. By the early 1860s he was no longer simply a neighborhood butcher. He had built a reputation for reliability and scale. He could deliver consistently. He could manage supply without panic. He could calculate margins without waste. When the War Department sought suppliers to provide meat to Union forces within 10 miles of Philadelphia, Peter submitted a bid. It was a bold move. Government contracts were not awarded casually. They required connections, credibility, and confidence in delivery. Failure could ruin a man financially and politically. Peter won the contract. The transition was immediate and dramatic. No longer confined to a single market stall, his operation expanded outward. Carcasses were purchased in larger quantities. Workers were hired to process and pack meat efficiently. Deliveries had to meet strict schedules. The scale was unlike anything he had previously attempted. He learned to coordinate shipments with military timetables. He learned to navigate bureaucratic paperwork. He learned how to maintain quality under pressure. There was no romance in it, just repetition, discipline, calculation. The war years were relentless. Soldiers flowed south. Wounded returned north. Demand remained constant. Contracts renewed. The profits accumulated steadily. By the time the war ended in 1865, Peter had saved approximately $50,000, a remarkable sum for a man who had begun behind a butcher's counter. Adjusted for modern value, it represented the foundation of real capital. But the money alone did not change him. The war had revealed something else. Scale was intoxicating. A small shop could sustain a family. A large contract could reshape a life. An infrastructure contract could reshape a city. Peter had watched Philadelphia during those war years. Factories expanded to support military production. Workers migrated into new neighborhoods. Streets grew more crowded. Horse-drawn streetcars rattled along expanding routes, carrying laborers from row houses to industrial districts. Transportation was no longer a convenience. It was necessity, and necessity created leverage. Peter did not rush recklessly into new ventures. He was patient. He invested cautiously at first. He strengthened relationships formed during wartime. He observed municipal spending. He paid attention to political appointments. He had learned something critical during the conflict. Governments needed suppliers they could trust. Trust could become influence. Influence could become access. Access could become opportunity. By the late 1860s, Philadelphia's public transit system was fragmented. Dozens of small companies operated individual lines. Each guarded its franchise. Each negotiated separately with the city. None coordinated efficiently. It reminded Peter of a butcher shop before organization. Pieces scattered, value unrealized. He began to consider consolidation. But first he stepped more firmly into politics. In 1873, when the Philadelphia city treasurer was removed amid scandal, the Republican leadership sought a replacement with business experience and a reputation for integrity. They chose Peter Widener. The salary was modest. The position was not. For 4 years he sat at the center of the city's finances. He saw how contracts were structured, how debt was managed, how franchises were granted. He met bankers, developers, industrialists. He began to think not in pounds of meat or even in thousands of dollars, but in systems. The butcher had accumulated capital. Now he was accumulating knowledge. And in America's rapidly industrializing cities, knowledge of infrastructure was worth far more than livestock. The war had given him money. Politics would give him power. Soon, he would meet the partner who shared his vision. And together, they would no longer serve the city. They would control how it moved. Power in 19th century America did not sit politely in marble buildings. It circulated through back rooms, private dinners, quiet understandings. When Peter Widener became Philadelphia's city treasurer in 1873, he stepped directly into that circulation. The appointment followed scandal. The previous treasurer had been removed for conspiracy. Public trust needed repair. The Republican machine required someone competent, disciplined, and financially literate. Widener fit the profile. He did not enter office as an ideologue. He entered as a businessman. From his desk, he observed the mechanics of municipal finance. He saw how bonds were issued, how debt obligations shaped policy, how contracts for infrastructure were awarded, and how carefully those contracts had to be negotiated among competing interests. City government was not chaos, it was choreography. Franchises for transportation lines were especially valuable. A streetcar franchise granted the right to lay tracks along specific routes. With routes came riders. With riders came steady revenue. But each franchise was negotiated separately. Each required political approval. Each involved local ward leaders and aldermen. Fragmentation made the system vulnerable, and vulnerability meant opportunity. Widener was not alone in recognizing this. During his years in public office, he formed a crucial partnership with William Lukens Elkins, an oil refiner and investor with comparable ambition. Where Widener understood municipal systems, Elkins understood capital markets. Together, they began to imagine consolidation. They did not want to compete with existing streetcar companies. They wanted to absorb them. The strategy was deliberate. Purchase controlling interests quietly, improve operations, expand routes, then acquire the next company, repeat until fragmentation disappeared. In 1875, they began buying streetcar franchises across Philadelphia. It was not dramatic at first. A line here, a small operator there. Many owners were willing to sell. The business required constant maintenance and offered unpredictable returns. Widener and Elkins offered stability. Behind the scenes, relationships cultivated during Widener's political tenure smoothed negotiations. City officials who had once debated contracts with him now saw advantage in coordination rather than competition. By the early 1880s, the acquisitions accelerated. Small operators merged into larger entities. Rival routes were unified. Overlapping inefficiencies reduced. In 1883, the Philadelphia Traction Company emerged as a consolidated force. The transformation was profound. Before consolidation, riders struggled with inconsistent fares and inconvenient transfers. After consolidation, schedules aligned, routes expanded, capital investments improved equipment. To the public, it appeared as modernization. To Widener, it was leverage. Control of transportation meant control of urban growth. Neighborhoods developed along trolley lines. Property values rose wherever tracks extended. Land purchased ahead of expansion multiplied in value once service arrived. Streetcars did not simply move people, they shaped cities. Criticism followed success. Reformers accused traction magnates of monopoly tactics. Newspapers questioned political influence. Public ownership advocates argued that transportation should serve citizens, not shareholders. Widener rarely responded directly. He believed in private enterprise as a superior organizer of systems. Efficiency justified consolidation. Profit justified risk. Whether the public agreed mattered less than the results. By the mid-1890s, the Philadelphia Traction Company began converting horse-drawn cars to electric power. The transition was decisive. Electric trolleys moved faster, carried more passengers, and reduced operating costs. The city's rhythm changed. The butcher's apprentice had become an architect of movement. And Philadelphia was only the beginning. Across America, cities faced the same fragmentation, the same inefficiencies, the same opportunity for consolidation. Widener and Elkins extended their reach beyond Pennsylvania. Investments spread from the Atlantic coast toward the industrial Midwest. The philosophy remained simple: unify, modernize, expand. Wealth accumulated quickly. But wealth, for Widener, was not an endpoint, it was a foundation. He had begun in a narrow shop with a sharpened blade. Now he operated within national networks of capital. Soon he would enter rooms with men whose ambitions dwarfed even streetcars. men who believed entire industries could be assembled like pieces on a board. The Gilded Age was reaching its height, and Peter Widener was ready to play at its scale. Some fortunes are built by instinct, others are built by alignment. Peter Arrol Brown, Widener had discipline, political access, and an eye for systems. William Lukens Elkins had capital, calculation, and patience. When they met in the 1870s, they recognized something in one another immediately. Neither man was interested in running a single profitable company. They were interested in control. Elkins had already accumulated wealth in oil refining and related ventures. He understood vertical integration, how supply chains could be tightened until profit leaked nowhere. He admired the logic of consolidation. Competition, in his view, was inefficient. Widener brought something equally valuable: municipal insight. He knew how franchises were negotiated. He understood how ward leaders operated. He knew which officials could be persuaded and which could not. Years in city finance had given him a map, not of streets, but of influence. Together they were formidable. Their strategy did not rely on spectacle. There were no dramatic public takeovers, no flamboyant declarations of dominance. Instead, they purchased quietly. A struggling line in one neighbourhood, a profitable but isolated route in another. Shares acquired gradually until control shifted without announcement. Where owners resisted, Elkins offered generous terms. Where political friction emerged, Widener navigated it. They did not destroy companies, they absorbed them. By 1880, their holdings in Philadelphia's streetcar network were substantial. By 1883, consolidation crystallized into the Philadelphia Traction Company, a single entity coordinating what had once been scattered competitors. The logic was mechanical. Unified schedules increased ridership, standardized fares simplified transfers, centralized maintenance reduced costs, profit margins widened. But the most important advantage lay beneath the rails: land. Widener and Elkins understood that transportation determined real estate value. If tracks extended into undeveloped neighborhoods, housing would follow. If housing followed, property prices would rise. So they purchased land ahead of expansion. Streetcar routes were not merely transit corridors, they were investment signals. When electrification arrived in the 1890s, the transformation accelerated. Horse-drawn cars, slow and expensive to maintain, gave way to electric trolleys powered by centralized stations. Speed increased, capacity expanded, maintenance costs fell. The city stretched outward along glowing lines of steel. Riders paid small fares, shareholders received large dividends. Critics accused them of building a monopoly. Reformers warned of excessive influence. Newspapers occasionally hinted at political favors exchanged quietly behind closed doors. Widener rarely defended himself publicly. He believed results justified consolidation. The system worked. The city moved, and movement meant prosperity. For investors, for landowners, for those who recognized direction before others did. By the turn of the century, their reach extended beyond Philadelphia. Transit interests in New York, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Chicago began to resemble a network rather than isolated holdings. The partnership functioned with remarkable efficiency. Elkins focused on finance, Widener focused on structure and relationships. There were no unnecessary displays of ego between them. Each respected the other's domain. Disagreements were handled privately. It was not friendship that bound them. It was alignment. As wealth accumulated, so did ambition. They began investing in broader industrial enterprises, railroads, steel, tobacco. They entered circles occupied by men whose names define the Gilded Age: J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Fortune Ryan. These were not merchants, they were architects of entire sectors. And in 1902 an opportunity emerged that extended beyond rails and into the Atlantic itself. J.P. Morgan sought to assemble a shipping trust, a unified system controlling transatlantic passenger lines. The International Mercantile Marine Company would consolidate major operators under one corporate umbrella. It was streetcar logic applied to the ocean: control routes, standardize operations, eliminate wasteful competition. Morgan invited Widener and Elkins to participate. They invested. Among the companies folded into the trust was a British passenger line called White Star. At the time, it seemed like another strategic decision: rational, calculated, profitable. No one in that boardroom imagined that 10 years later, one of White Star's ships would carry 2 generations of the Widener family into darkness. For now, the partnership thrived. The butcher's apprentice had become a traction magnate. The city moved at his command, and the rails he laid across Philadelphia would soon echo across the ocean. By the early 1880s, Philadelphia no longer felt fragmented. That had been the point. Before Peter Widener and William Elkins began their quiet campaign, the city's streetcar system resembled a patchwork quilt stitched by rival hands. Each neighborhood had its own operator. Each operator guarded its route jealously. Transfers required additional fares. Schedules overlapped inefficiently. Horses strained against steel tracks that led nowhere coordinated. To most residents, it was inconvenience. To Widener, it was opportunity. He had learned as a butcher that waste could be eliminated with careful cuts. Now he applied the same logic to transportation. Instead of trimming fat from carcasses, he trimmed inefficiency from infrastructure. The acquisitions accelerated. Some companies sold willingly. Rising maintenance costs and unpredictable ridership made independent operation difficult. Others resisted, fearing absorption into something larger. Resistance rarely lasted. Widener and Elkins did not rely on intimidation. They relied on patience. Offers were structured attractively. Political relationships ensured that regulatory barriers remained manageable. Financing was arranged efficiently. One by one, the lines fell into alignment. When the Philadelphia Traction Company formally consolidated operations, the transformation was not only economic, it was psychological. Passengers no longer saw separate operators, they saw a system. Standardized fares simplified daily commutes. Coordinated routes connected distant neighborhoods. For the first time, workers in industrial districts could travel reliably to factories miles away. The city stretched outward, and as it stretched, land values followed the rails. Widener and Elkins had anticipated this. Long before announcing route expansions, they quietly purchased property along proposed lines. Fields that seemed peripheral became valuable once tracks were laid. Housing developments rose, shops followed. Transportation did not merely respond to urban growth, it shaped it. Electrification intensified the effect. Horse-drawn cars had limits. They required feeding, stabling, constant care. Their pace was slow, their endurance finite. Electric trolleys moved differently. They hummed rather than clattered. They accelerated smoothly. They carried more passengers at lower cost. They signaled modernity. By 1892, the transition from horse to electric was underway. Within a few years, Philadelphia's network was among the most advanced in the country. Profits multiplied, but so did criticism. Editorials accused traction magnates of consolidating too much power. Reformers argued that public transportation should be municipally owned. Political opponents hinted at favoritism in franchise negotiations. Widener remained measured. He believed private management, disciplined by profit and guided by investment, delivered superior outcomes. The improved equipment and expanded service spoke for themselves. He did not chase public affection. He pursued structural control. By the mid-1890s, his influence extended beyond the city. Transit investments reached into New York and Baltimore. Financial partnerships connected him to banking networks previously reserved for industrial titans. The butcher's son was no longer a local figure. He was part of a national pattern. The Gilded Age rewarded consolidation. Railroads merged into systems. Steel plants unified under corporate umbrellas. Trusts replaced competition with coordination. Widener understood the logic intuitively. Fragmentation was weakness. Unification was strength. The rails beneath Philadelphia were proof, but infrastructure was only one expression of permanence. Wealth accumulated rapidly, dividends flowed, investments multiplied. The Widener name began appearing in national financial reports. With wealth came a different question. How should it be displayed? In the 1890s, as profits rose and influence solidified, Peter Widener faced personal loss. His wife, Hannah, died in 1896. The townhouse on North Broad Street, once animated by family gatherings and political dinners, felt altered. Widener had mastered movement. Now he desired something immovable, something built not on steel rails but on stone. The rails had made him rich. The next chapter would make him monumental. At first, the horses disappeared quietly. There was no grand farewell, no ceremony marking the end of their labour. For decades, they had pulled streetcars through Philadelphia's growing neighbourhoods, hooves striking iron tracks embedded in stone. They had defined the rhythm of the city, but horses were slow, they tired, they required feed, stables, constant replacement. Their pace set a ceiling on growth. Electricity promised something different. By the early 1890s, the technology had matured enough to transform urban transportation. Overhead wires, power stations, and electric motors offered speed and efficiency that animal power could not match. Many operators hesitated. Conversion required heavy capital investment. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt, tracks adjusted, power plants constructed. Widener did not hesitate. He had never been sentimental about systems. If a method could be improved, it would be improved. The Philadelphia Traction Company began converting its lines in earnest around 1892. Power stations rose near industrial corridors. Steel poles lined the streets. Overhead wires traced new patterns across the sky. When the first electric cars began moving, residents felt the difference immediately. They accelerated faster. They climbed inclines without strain. They carried more passengers in a single trip. They arrived with reliability that horse teams could not guarantee. Operating costs dropped, ridership increased, profits surged, but electrification was not simply about mechanics. It symbolized modernity. It told the city that Philadelphia was no longer provincial, no longer dependent on 19th century methods. It was industrial, forward-looking, efficient. Widener understood symbolism almost as well as numbers. Every electrified line reinforced his reputation as a builder of systems. Investors admired the boldness. Critics begrudgingly acknowledged effectiveness. Reformers continued to question monopoly power, but riders rarely complained about speed. Beyond the immediate financial return, electrification strengthened another dimension of Widener's strategy: real estate leverage. Electric lines could extend farther than horse-drawn routes. New neighborhoods became accessible. Commuters were willing to live at greater distances from factories and commercial districts. Land purchased quietly years earlier now appreciated dramatically. Streets once considered remote became desirable. Housing developments rose alongside newly installed tracks. Shops followed rooftops. Churches followed families. Movement shaped settlement, and settlement generated revenue beyond fares. Widener's fortune began to detach from any single enterprise. Streetcars remained central, but investments diversified. Banks, railroads, industrial concerns, all connected through networks of capital typical of the Gilded Age. In private circles, his name was spoken alongside men who thought not in storefronts but in sectors. He was no longer simply managing transportation, he was managing influence. Yet success did not insulate him from criticism. Newspapers occasionally published editorials accusing traction magnates of excessive political leverage. Civic reform movements argued for municipal ownership of utilities. Populist voices warned that concentrated power threatened democratic balance. Widener rarely answered publicly. He believed infrastructure should be measured by function. Did the cars run? Did the routes expand? Did investors receive returns? In his calculus, the answers justified consolidation. By the mid-1890s, the electrified network hummed daily across Philadelphia. Sparks flashed occasionally beneath trolley poles. Steel wheels sang faintly against rails. The city's pulse accelerated. Workers commuted more efficiently. Commerce moved faster. Urban sprawl extended outward. And as the rails expanded, so did Widener's ambition. Electricity had changed the streets. Now he would consider something more enduring than motion. For all the speed of steel and wire, nothing signalled permanence like stone. The empire of rails had been secured. The next expression of wealth would not move at all. By the end of the 19th century, Peter Arrol Brown Widener had become something more than a businessman. He had become a symbol. To investors, he represented competence, a man who could identify inefficiency, eliminate it, and convert it into profit. To reformers, he represented something more troubling, consolidation carried to its logical extreme. The word most often whispered was monopoly. Philadelphia's transit system no longer resembled a chaotic patchwork of independent operators. It had become centralized, coordinated, disciplined. It had also become profitable in ways that were impossible to ignore. Fares were steady. Dividends were reliable. Land values rose predictably along expanding routes. Streetcars had ceased to be merely transportation. They were instruments of urban design. But when one company controls movement, criticism follows naturally. Newspapers questioned the political relationships that had facilitated franchise approvals. Editorials warned that concentrated power could distort public interest. Civic reform organizations argued that transit should belong to the people who depended upon it, not to shareholders expecting returns. The broader climate of the era intensified scrutiny. The 1890s were marked by labor unrest, economic depressions, and populist agitation against industrial trusts. Railroads, steel companies, oil refiners all faced mounting suspicion. The phrase "robber baron" entered the national vocabulary. Widener did not fit the theatrical stereotype of a flamboyant industrial magnate. He avoided spectacle. He did not issue grand public statements defending capitalism. He rarely appeared in headlines by choice. His style was restrained, but restraint did not shield him from association. The Philadelphia Traction Company, by virtue of its dominance, became an example in debates about private control of public utilities. Public ownership advocates cited streetcars as essential infrastructure. Reform candidates campaigned on promises to regulate or reclaim transit systems. Yet ridership remained high. For the average commuter, reliability outweighed ideology. The electric cars arrived on schedule. Transfers were smoother than before consolidation. Expansion reached neighborhoods previously underserved. Widener understood a quiet truth. Most citizens judge systems by daily experience, not political theory. Still, reputation required careful management. He cultivated relationships with civic leaders and philanthropies. He supported educational initiatives. He maintained a public image of sobriety and responsibility. He did not flaunt wealth recklessly. But wealth was becoming increasingly visible. The Gilded Age did not hide its fortunes easily. Lavish residences, art collections, and elite social gatherings made power tangible, and Widener's fortune had grown beyond local prominence. By the turn of the century, his investments connected him to national figures: J.P. Morgan assembling industrial trusts, Andrew Carnegie dominating steel, Thomas Fortune Ryan controlling transit in New York. These men did not think in terms of individual companies. They thought in networks. Widener belonged to that world now. His seat at the table was not accidental. It was earned through consolidation and discipline. Yet consolidation carries an inherent tension. Efficiency and dominance often travel together. As criticism intensified across America against trusts and monopolies, Widener faced a choice: retreat into quieter holdings or expand further into integrated systems that promised even greater returns. He chose expansion. The logic that unified streetcars could unify shipping lines. The same discipline that electrified Philadelphia could electrify entire industries. And so, when J.P. Morgan proposed assembling a vast transatlantic shipping trust, the International Mercantile Marine Company, Widener recognized familiar principles: control routes, standardize operations, eliminate competition. The ocean, like the city, could be systematized. It was an investment decision grounded in strategy, not sentiment. But unlike rails, the ocean answered to forces no balance sheet could command. Widener's reputation as a consolidator was secure. What remained unseen was the quiet link forming between his financial empire and a vessel that would soon become the most famous ship in history. The rails beneath Philadelphia had defined his ascent. The Atlantic would define his loss. By the dawn of the 20th century, Peter Arrol Brown Widener no longer operated in the margins of industry. He had entered its center. The Gilded Age had produced a new class of American power brokers, men who thought not in storefronts or even cities, but in sectors. Railroads were no longer individual lines, they were systems. Steel mills were no longer isolated furnaces, they were integrated empires. Finance itself was consolidating into structured networks directed from a handful of offices in New York. Widener belonged in that room. He had proven that fragmentation could be reorganized into profit. Philadelphia's streetcars were evidence. Electrification had confirmed his willingness to invest boldly when others hesitated. Now he began participating in enterprises far beyond Pennsylvania. He invested in railroads that stretched across states. He placed capital into banking ventures that underwrote national expansion. When J.P. Morgan assembled United States Steel in 1901, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, Widener held a stake. The butcher's apprentice from Philadelphia was now a participant in America's largest industrial trust. Morgan's philosophy aligned with Widener's instinct: coordination over chaos, consolidation over competition, efficiency as justification. Industries were being rationalized, railroads merged, oil refineries aligned, tobacco companies unified under corporate umbrellas. And then there was shipping. The Atlantic in the early 1900s was not merely water. It was a corridor of migration, commerce, and prestige. Passenger liners carried immigrants in steerage and millionaires in first-class salons. Competition between British, German, and American lines was fierce. Schedules were independent. Fares fluctuated. Brand loyalty was fragile. Morgan saw inefficiency. He proposed assembling the major transatlantic passenger lines into a single corporate entity, the International Mercantile Marine Company. By acquiring or controlling multiple operators, IMM could coordinate departures, stabilize fares, and dominate ocean travel between Europe and America. It was streetcar logic applied to the sea. Widener recognized the pattern immediately. He invested. Among the companies folded into Morgan's trust was a respected British line, White Star. White Star had built a reputation for comfort rather than speed. Its ships were stable, elegant, dependable. Within Morgan's structure, White Star would become part of a coordinated Atlantic network. At the time, it was a rational allocation of capital. Shipping was expanding. Immigration to America surged. Transatlantic travel remained essential for commerce and diplomacy. Participation in IMM placed Widener inside another system designed for dominance. There was no drama in the boardroom, no sense of impending tragedy, just signatures on documents, shares exchanged, projections calculated. Yet within that structure, plans were forming for a new class of vessel, ships larger and more luxurious than anything previously constructed. Olympic-class liners. Among them would be one named Titanic. When Widener reviewed his investments, he likely saw shipping as another diversified interest among many. Streetcars, steel, banking, shipping, all components of a balanced portfolio. But investment is never purely abstract. Money flows into steel, steel becomes hull, hull becomes ship, and one day a grandson boards it. At the height of his power, Widener had achieved what few immigrants' sons ever imagined. He sat among financiers who shaped continents. His wealth was secure, his influence undeniable. Yet even as his portfolio expanded across industries, something else was taking shape closer to home. Loss would soon arrive in a form he could not rationalize, and in response he would build not a system, but a monument. When Peter Arrol Brown Widener invested in the International Mercantile Marine Company in 1902, it did not feel dramatic. It felt logical. J.P. Morgan's plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Atlantic shipping business was fragmented, competitive, and volatile. Too many lines chasing too many passengers across the same ocean lanes. Profits fluctuated. Rivalry drove down fares. Prestige mattered, but coordination mattered more. Morgan intended to bring order. Through IMM, he absorbed major transatlantic carriers into a unified structure. Schedules would be managed strategically, rates stabilized, resources consolidated. It was the same principle that had transformed Philadelphia's streetcars, but on a global scale. Widener understood this instinctively. Control the routes, and you control the revenue. Among IMM's acquisitions was the White Star Line, a British company known less for speed than for refinement. White Star vessels emphasized comfort, space, and dignity at sea. Their ships carried aristocrats, industrialists, emigrants, and dreamers alike. Within a few years, White Star would commission a new class of liners designed to restore dominance in prestige. The Olympic-class ships would be immense, floating palaces engineered to project stability and power. Steel hulls divided into watertight compartments, electric lighting throughout, grand staircases and first-class salons that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. These ships would not simply cross the Atlantic, they would symbolize modern achievement. Titanic was one of them. Launched in 1911 at Harland and Wolff's Belfast shipyard, Titanic embodied confidence. At 882 feet in length and over 46,000 tons, she was the largest moving structure ever built at the time. Her designers believed the compartment system made her effectively unsinkable under ordinary conditions. Investors saw prestige, passengers saw luxury, The press saw progress. For Widener, Titanic represented one small piece of a vast portfolio. He had stakes in steel that supplied her plates, financial institutions that insured her voyages, and transit systems that moved passengers to ports. He did not obsess over ships. He trusted systems, and the system appeared sound. By 1912, Titanic was ready for her maiden voyage. Tickets sold quickly. First-class accommodations filled with names recognizable across continents. Millionaires, titled aristocrats, captains of industry. Among them would be members of the Widener family. It is tempting to imagine that Widener felt a sense of pride in the vessel, that he saw in Titanic the culmination of industrial organization he admired. Perhaps he did, but investments often feel distant from their consequences. Money moves silently. Steel is forged in faraway yards. Ships sail under captains who follow their own judgment. Oceans answer to weather, not shareholders. When Titanic departed Southampton on April 10th, 1912, she carried more than passengers. She carried confidence in industrial rationality, and she carried 2 generations of the Widener name. The link between capital and catastrophe had not yet revealed itself. In boardrooms, numbers still aligned neatly. On the open Atlantic, ice drifted unseen. The investment that once symbolized expansion would soon become inseparable from loss. And when the telegram arrived days later at Linwood Hall, the abstraction of shares would dissolve into something far more personal. The sea does not negotiate. It does not respond to consolidation. And no portfolio, however diversified, can hedge against grief. Wealth can reorganize cities. It can electrify streets, assemble industries, and move millions of people each day. It cannot prevent absence. In the autumn of 1896, long before the Titanic ever touched water, loss entered Peter Errol Brown Widener's life quietly. His wife, Hannah Josephine Dunton Widener, died while the family was travelling along the coast of Maine. She was 60 years old. They had been married for nearly 4 decades. For a man who had spent his life building systems, Hannah had been the constant within them. She had watched the butcher's shop become a contract operation. She had watched streetcar acquisitions multiply. She had hosted dinners where businessmen debated expansion beneath gaslight. Her absence altered the centre of his world. The townhouse on North Broad Street, once animated with guests and conversation, felt suddenly diminished. The rooms remained large, the silver polished, the staff attentive, but something essential had shifted. Widener was not a man inclined toward public displays of grief. He responded the way he always had, by building. If the old house felt incomplete, he would create something new, something grand enough to hold memory, something immovable. He purchased nearly 300 acres in Elkins Park, north of Philadelphia. The land rolled gently through woods and open fields, removed from the industrial noise of the city. Here, he would construct a residence unlike any other in America. The project was not modest, it was not restrained, it was deliberate. He commissioned architect Horace Trumbauer, a young designer with an intuitive grasp of European classical forms. Trumbauer studied Prior Park in England, an 18th-century Palladian mansion overlooking Bath, and returned with plans that expanded upon the original inspiration. Construction began in 1897. For 2 years the estate took shape. Indiana limestone walls rose against the sky. Marble columns were installed in grand halls. Bronze balustrades curved along sweeping staircases. Imported tapestries lined walls. Chandeliers cast measured light across polished floors. The ballroom alone could host 1,000 guests. It was not merely a residence. It was a statement. Widener named it Linwood Hall. The estate was designed not only for living, but for permanence. Its galleries would house his expanding art collection. Its gardens would unfold in geometric precision. Its proportions would echo European aristocracy, a declaration that the son of a bricklayer had secured a place among cultural custodians. When Linwood Hall opened with a gala in December 1899, Philadelphia society responded with awe. Carriages arrived through iron gates. Music filled marble corridors. Paintings by old masters hung in newly completed galleries. Widener had translated grief into stone. He had replaced absence with architecture. Yet the family continued to experience loss. Years earlier, he had buried his eldest son Harry, who died of typhoid fever at 11. Now only 2 sons remained, George and Joseph. George, steady and practical, entered the family business. Joseph, refined and introspective, gravitated toward art. And George's son, young Harry Elkins Widener, wandered through Linwood's galleries, absorbing beauty from childhood. The mansion became both refuge and exhibition. Widener opened portions of the collection to the public each summer. Visitors walked through halls lined with Rembrandt and Raphael, unaware that the building itself had been born from mourning. Linwood Hall symbolized continuity. But continuity is fragile. The walls were solid, the galleries luminous. Yet beyond those limestone facades, forces moved invisibly, in boardrooms, in shipyards, in cold Atlantic currents. The house had been built to keep family close. It would soon echo with silence once again. Grief had given Peter Arrol Brown Widener a new objective. Not expansion, not consolidation, but permanence. If the city had made him wealthy and industry had made him powerful, architecture would make him remembered. When Widener selected Horace Trumbauer to design his new estate, it surprised some observers. Trumbauer was not formally trained in Europe. He had not attended the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris like many fashionable architects of the era. He had begun as an office boy and learned through relentless study and practice. But Widener did not want fashionable. He wanted monumental. Trumbauer understood scale. More importantly, he understood what wealthy American industrialists desired at the turn of the century. European legitimacy translated into American confidence. Widener instructed him to study Prior Park in Bath, England, a Palladian mansion built in the 18th century. Its sweeping colonnades and symmetrical facade conveyed aristocratic continuity. It was a house that suggested lineage. Widener had no lineage of dukes or earls behind him. He intended to construct one in stone. Trumbauer travelled to England, measured proportions, sketched elevations, photographed details. When he returned to Pennsylvania, he did not replicate Prior Park, he enlarged it. The design for Linwood Hall expanded upon Palladian symmetry with American boldness. The central block rose in pale Indiana limestone. Curving colonnades extended outward in graceful arcs, framing the entrance drive like open arms. The house would contain 110 rooms. Construction began in 1897 and continued for nearly 2 years. Foundations were laid deep into the earth. Limestone blocks were hauled and set with precision. Skilled craftsmen arrived from Europe to execute interior details. The entrance hall soared upward 2 stories. Green marble columns supported ceilings adorned with gold leaf. A grand staircase curved toward the upper floors, its bronze railings catching afternoon light from tall windows. Every room was scaled for ceremony. The ballroom alone stretched long enough to host an orchestra and hundreds of guests. Murals were painted across ceilings by Italian artisans brought specifically for the project. Furniture arrived from France. Doors cast in Florence. Tapestries once owned by European nobility were installed along panelled walls. The estate's grounds matched the architecture. Formal gardens unfolded in Italian patterns. Clipped hedges, symmetrical beds, fountains reflecting the sky. Greenhouses ensured flowers year-round. Stables housed horses and carriages. A gatehouse controlled entry from the road. The cost exceeded $8 million, an extraordinary sum at the turn of the century. But Widener did not build for frugality. He built for endurance. When Linwood Hall opened in December 1899 with a grand gala, 400 guests arrived through iron gates and up a sweeping drive illuminated by lamps. Music from the New York Symphony Orchestra echoed through marble corridors. Philadelphia society gasped. Some admired, some resented. All understood the message. The bricklayer's son had constructed an American palace. But Linwood was not only about display. Widener intended it to house his art collection, a collection that was evolving from decorative acquisition into serious pursuit. Entire wings were designed as galleries. Lighting systems were engineered to diffuse natural light across canvases without damage. The mansion functioned as both residence and museum. Each summer, portions would be open to the public. Visitors could apply for admission and walk through rooms filled with masterpieces. In that decision, architecture crossed into philanthropy. Widener had built a monument not only to himself, but to culture. Yet even as stone walls rose and ceilings gleamed, life within them continued to unfold. George moved into the estate with his wife, Eleanor, and their children. The youngest generation grew up beneath painted ceilings and beside marble statues. Among them was Harry. He wandered through galleries as if they were hallways. He would not inherit the house in the way his grandfather imagined, but he would inherit something else, an obsession. When Linwood Hall opened its doors in December 1899, it did more than welcome guests. It announced arrival. 400 invitations had been issued for the inaugural gala. Carriages and early motorcars rolled through iron gates and along a curving drive framed by newly planted trees. Lanterns cast soft light across limestone facades. Inside, marble reflected the glow of chandeliers suspended from gilded ceilings. Philadelphia had seen wealth before. It had not seen this. The entrance hall rose in measured symmetry, columns of green marble lifting the eye toward a ceiling designed for awe rather than comfort. The grand staircase curved with theatrical elegance. Every proportion had been calculated to inspire a certain silence upon entry. Guests moved slowly. They looked upward more often than forward. In the ballroom, space itself felt amplified. The ceiling stretched above in painted splendour. Italian craftsmen had executed murals designed to evoke European palaces. Music from the orchestra drifted through the hall, softened by tapestries imported from noble estates overseas. Tables were set with precision. Silver gleamed. Conversations lingered in polished tones. Some attendees admired openly. Others masked envy beneath polite observation. Newspapers the following morning described Linwood Hall as the finest private residence in America. Comparisons to Versailles surfaced quickly. The nickname would endure for decades. The American Versailles. Yet Widener did not build merely for spectacle. He built for permanence. Beyond the reception rooms lay galleries arranged specifically for art. Walls were spaced to accommodate large canvases without crowding. Skylights incorporated adjustable mechanisms to diffuse natural light evenly across paintings. The system was considered innovative, protective of pigments while allowing clarity of view. The mansion functioned as both private sanctuary and cultural institution. Each summer, Widener opened portions of the collection to the public. Visitors could apply for admission and tour galleries containing works that rivaled major European museums. Rembrandt's shadows, Raphael's luminous Madonnas, Flemish portraits with expressions centuries old. Linwood blurred boundaries between home and museum. Children played beneath ceilings painted in Renaissance style. Servants moved quietly through corridors lined with priceless art. Formal gardens unfolded outside, their geometric patterns suggesting order imposed upon nature itself. But the house also carried memory. It had been conceived after the death of Widener's wife Hannah. Built partly in response to absence, the mansion became an attempt to anchor family continuity in stone. George Widener, his son, settled there with his wife Eleanor and their children. Joseph, the younger son, spent increasing time among the galleries refining the collection. The next generation grew up not among modest parlour paintings, but among old masters. Young Harry Elkins Widener wandered through these rooms almost casually. Marble columns did not intimidate him. Rembrandt did not astonish him. It was the world he knew. Yet within the grandeur another sensibility was forming, quieter, more intimate than canvases stretching across walls. While his grandfather measured value in paintings and architecture, Harry began measuring it in pages. But for now, Linwood Hall stood as the physical expression of Widener's ascent. The butcher's son had achieved something extraordinary. He had built not merely a house, but an assertion that American wealth could equal European heritage. Stone answered grief, art answered ambition, and the American Versailles gleamed under winter light, unaware that one day its halls would echo differently. Grandeur does not prevent loss, it only magnifies its silence. At first, Peter Arrol Brown Widener bought paintings the way many wealthy men of the late 19th century did, as confirmation. Land confirmed status. Industry confirmed influence. Art confirmed culture. In the early years, his acquisitions were respectable but conventional. Landscapes with warm skies, portraits of minor European nobility, decorative works that filled walls and signalled prosperity without demanding scholarly attention. They were appropriate, they were impressive, they were not yet extraordinary. Something shifted in the 1880s and 1890s. Perhaps it was travel, perhaps it was exposure to European galleries, perhaps it was the quiet competitiveness that drove many Gilded Age collectors to seek not just ownership, but distinction. Widener began to study. He read catalogues, consulted dealers, compared brushwork and provenance. He moved beyond decoration into discernment. He no longer wanted paintings merely attributed to masters, he wanted masterpieces. The art market of the era made such ambition possible. European aristocratic families, burdened by taxes and shifting economies, began quietly selling works held for generations. Dealers acted as intermediaries, connecting American industrial wealth with Old World heritage. Among them was Joseph Duveen, perhaps the most influential art dealer of the age. Duveen understood two things clearly. Europe possessed treasures, and America possessed buyers. He cultivated relationships carefully. He presented collectors with opportunities framed not just as purchases, but as destiny. The chance to rescue great works from obscurity and relocate them to rising American institutions. Widener proved receptive. The Rembrandts came first. Over time, he acquired 14 works by the Dutch master, more than any private American collector of his era. Among them was the Mill, a brooding landscape heavy with atmosphere and shadow. Its presence alone signalled seriousness. Then came Raphael. The small Cowper Madonna, painted around 1505, radiated balance and serenity. The Virgin and Child set against an Italian landscape, luminous and restrained. It was intimate, refined, and unquestionably authentic. Widener did not flinch at price. He prioritized quality above all. Vermeer followed. Rarer still. Woman holding a balance entered the collection, its quiet symbolism resonating with collectors and scholars alike. A young woman weighing pearls beneath a painting of the Last Judgment, earthly wealth measured against eternity. The irony was not lost on later observers. Widener continued. Van Dyck, Bellini, Titian, El Greco, Gainsborough, Reynolds. Each acquisition sharpened the collection's coherence. He was no longer gathering decorative art. He was assembling a narrative of Western painting. Entire wings of Linwood Hall were redesigned to display the works properly. Rooms were organised by school and era. Lighting systems were adjusted. Velvet wall coverings enhanced tonal depth. Visitors were encouraged to linger. Every summer, the galleries opened to the public. Thousands applied for entry. For many Americans, Linwood offered their first encounter with works previously accessible only in Europe. Widener believed culture should elevate society. Ownership did not preclude access, but collecting was not purely philanthropic, it was competitive. American magnates quietly measured themselves against one another through art. Henry Clay Frick, Isabella Stewart Gardner, Andrew Mellon, and Henry Huntington all built collections that would later anchor major museums. Widener joined their ranks. Within the marble halls, conversations about brushstrokes and provenance replaced discussions of streetcar dividends. Joseph, his younger son, gravitated naturally toward this world. He refined the collection further, trading lesser works for greater ones, guided by scholarship rather than sentiment. But elsewhere in the house, another form of collecting was taking shape. In smaller rooms lined with shelves rather than gilded frames, young Harry Elkins Widener developed a different obsession. Where his grandfather sought pigment and canvas, Harry sought ink and paper. The walls of Linwood glowed with oil paintings centuries old. Soon, its quieter corners would fill with volumes just as rare. The Widener legacy was expanding, from rails to stone to art, and now to books. Linwood Hall was built as a palace, but Peter Arrol Brown Widener did not intend it to remain sealed. Each summer, when the air warmed and the gardens bloomed into geometric precision, the gates opened. Admission was not casual. Visitors applied in advance. Invitations were granted selectively. Yet once inside, the experience was unlike anything most Americans had known. They stepped through marble halls not as servants or guests of privilege, but as observers. Paintings that had once hung in European castles now lined the walls of a suburban estate in Pennsylvania. Rembrandt's shadows deepened under filtered skylight. Raphael's Madonna glowed softly against velvet panels. Van Dyck's aristocrats looked down upon ordinary citizens walking slowly beneath them. The contrast was deliberate. Widener believed art should elevate those who encountered it. He had accumulated masterpieces through private wealth, but he resisted confining them entirely to private admiration. Linwood functioned as a hybrid, residence and museum intertwined. The lighting system, innovative for its time, allowed canvases to be seen clearly without glare. Skylights were fitted with adjustable screens to diffuse sunlight. Chairs were placed thoughtfully in certain galleries, inviting contemplation rather than hurried viewing. Visitors moved quietly. Many had never stood before an original Rembrandt. They had seen engravings, perhaps reproductions in books, but here the brushstrokes were visible. The texture of paint revealed the artist's hand. The atmosphere felt almost ecclesiastical. Silence, interrupted only by footsteps against polished floors. Outside, the gardens reinforced the sense of order. Italianate terraces, clipped hedges, fountains reflecting blue sky. The symmetry suggested permanence. Nature disciplined into design. Widener observed these openings carefully. He walked the galleries, noting reactions. He saw awe in faces that entered with curiosity and left subdued. It pleased him. Culture, in his view, justified wealth. Industry generated capital. Art refined it. Yet the house remained a home. George and Eleanor raised their children within these walls. Servants maintained routines that kept grandeur functioning smoothly. Formal dinners continued in winter. Music echoed through the ballroom during private gatherings. But summer transformed the estate. The public arrived. Philadelphia society had already accepted Linwood as emblematic of Gilded Age splendor. Now broader audiences experienced it as something almost civic. Other collectors followed similar paths. Across America, private fortunes began evolving into public institutions. Museums expanded. Libraries grew. Cultural philanthropy became an extension of industrial success. Widener's approach was transitional. Not yet full donation, but not isolation either. He seemed to sense that collections outlived collectors. Stone endured, paintings endured, but men did not. In quieter rooms away from the grand galleries, young Harry Elkins Widener wandered among shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. He respected the paintings. He admired their scale. But books offered something different. Intimacy. A painting commands a wall. A book fits in the hand. Within Linwood's marble corridors, two forms of legacy were developing side by side. One would hang in Washington. The other would sink into the Atlantic. For now the house stood luminous and alive, open to the public, confident in its permanence. It did not yet know how empty permanence could feel. Harry Elkins. Widener grew up in a house where silence carried weight. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of value. Footsteps echoed differently in Linwood Hall. Voices softened instinctively beneath painted ceilings. Even as a child, Harry understood that the walls around him held objects that did not belong to ordinary time. He was born on January 3, 1885, into extraordinary privilege. His father, George Dunton Widener, managed large portions of the family's business interests. His mother, Eleanor Elkins Widener, was the daughter of William Lukens Elkins, Peter Widener's powerful partner. The marriage had fused two fortunes into one lineage. Harry inherited both. But wealth, to a child, is simply environment. He wandered past Rembrandt as others passed framed photographs. He climbed staircases of green marble without pausing to consider their rarity. He played beneath chandeliers imported from Europe. The grandeur was normal. What fascinated him was smaller. Books lined certain rooms quietly, often overlooked by guests who were drawn instead to canvases and sculpture. Leather spines, gilt lettering, pages edged in gold. Harry discovered them early. He liked the way they felt in his hands. Textured, weighted, deliberate. He would open them slowly, inhaling the faint scent of old paper and binding glue. Unlike paintings, books invited touch. Paintings required distance. Books allowed intimacy. Tutors educated him within the estate's walls before he left for formal schooling. He proved intelligent, though not driven by conventional ambition. His curiosity ran toward language and history rather than industry. At the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, he distinguished himself less through athletic achievement and more through quiet focus. Classmates noted his reserved manner. He did not flaunt his wealth. He did not dominate conversation, but he collected. While other boys spent allowances on amusements, Harry sought out early editions of favourite authors. Robert Louis Stevenson became an early focus. First editions, variant printings, specific binding conditions. He learned quickly that rarity existed in nuance. By the time he entered Harvard in 1903, his passion had sharpened into seriousness. Cambridge exposed him to a broader world of collectors. The Grolier Club in New York gathered serious bibliophiles, men who treated books not merely as reading material, but as artifacts. Harry absorbed their language. provenance, collation, typography, imprint. He studied bibliographies with the same attention his grandfather once gave transit ledgers. The comparison was subtle, but real. Where Peter Widener had consolidated rails, Harry sought to consolidate editions. Where Peter valued mastery in painting, Harry valued authenticity in print. His collection grew steadily. Shakespeare folios, 17th century English literature, works by Milton, Spencer, Caxton. Volumes that connected him to centuries of thought preserved in ink. Dealers began to recognize him as more than a wealthy young buyer. S.W. Rosenbach, the prominent Philadelphia bookseller, later remarked on Harry's discernment. He was not careless. He did not purchase merely to impress. He pursued coherence. Within Linwood Hall, a quiet parallel legacy was forming. In the galleries, Rembrandt's shadows deepened under skylight. In Harry's rooms, pages turned gently under lamplight. He dreamed not of a mansion, but of a library. Not a private shelf hidden in a palace, but an institution where scholars could study rare volumes long after he was gone. He spoke of building something lasting. He had decades ahead, it seemed. Europe called to collectors like him. Auctions in London dispersed aristocratic libraries. Opportunities emerged where old wealth met new capital. In the spring of 1912, Harry prepared to travel once more. Paris for family business, London for books. He would board a new ship for the return voyage, a vessel described as the safest ever constructed. He carried his dreams lightly, and he carried a small volume purchased in Grafton Street. The House of Marble had shaped him, but his legacy would be measured in paper, and paper, unlike stone, can vanish in water without leaving a trace. When Harry Elkins Widener arrived at Harvard in the autumn of 1903, he did not arrive as a provincial student dazzled by reputation. He arrived prepared. Cambridge offered something Linwood Hall could not: intellectual community. Professors who debated literary history with authority. Students who competed not in inheritance, but in ideas. Libraries whose stacks extended beyond family holdings. Harry found his place quickly. He was not the loudest in the room. He did not dominate discussion sections with theatrical gestures, but he listened closely, spoke carefully, and absorbed everything. Harvard's libraries fascinated him more than lecture halls. Gore Hall, the university's primary library at the time, stood in Gothic form at the centre of campus. Its shelves were already crowded. Editions had been improvised. Space strained under growing collections. Harry noticed these limitations. He imagined what could be done differently. Beyond campus, another circle awaited him, the world of serious collectors. The Grolier Club in New York gathered bibliophiles who treated books as artifacts of civilization. Membership was selective. Discussions ranged from binding techniques to Renaissance printers, from Shakespeare folios to the early history of typography. Harry entered that world with quiet confidence. Older members expected a wealthy young man with enthusiasm and little discipline. They found instead someone precise. He could discuss variant editions. He could explain why one imprint carried greater historical significance than another. He understood the importance of condition, how a missing page or replaced binding altered value dramatically. He had studied. He formed relationships with dealers who recognized seriousness beneath youth. Bernard Quaritch in London, Rosenbach in Philadelphia. These men dealt not in casual literature but in rarity. Harry attended auctions not merely to purchase, but to observe bidding patterns. He noted how rival collectors operated. Henry Huntington, the California Railroad magnate, emerged as a competitor in certain circles, a man with deeper pockets and similar appetite. Competition sharpened Harry's focus. He was not reckless with money. He pursued strategy. English literature from the 16th and 17th centuries became a cornerstone. Shakespeare's folios, monumental in literary history, joined his collection through family acquisition. Works by Milton, Spencer, and Caxton followed. His rooms at Harvard began to resemble a private archive, yet he did not view the books as trophies. He imagined them housed in a dedicated institution, a library designed specifically for rare volumes, climate control, proper shelving, quiet reading rooms for scholars. He spoke of it openly. Friends indulged him, half amused, half impressed. It seemed a romantic ambition, a young man dreaming of stone buildings for paper treasures. But Harry was serious. He believed books were vessels of thought. They preserved minds across centuries. They connected generations. His grandfather built rails that moved bodies. Harry wanted to build a space that moved ideas. In 1907, he graduated from Harvard. He entered the family business dutifully, but his passion remained in collecting. Travel to Europe became routine. Auctions in London and Paris offered opportunities American buyers could rarely resist. By 1912, his collection exceeded 3,000 volumes. It was not enormous by institutional standards, but it was coherent, focused, deliberate. And he was only 27. He had decades ahead to refine it, expand it, perhaps realize the library he envisioned. In early spring, he wrote to a friend about an upcoming trip to England. He would sail out, conduct business, visit dealers, and return on the maiden voyage of a new White Star liner, the Titanic. He mentioned it casually. No collector plans for catastrophe. He packed carefully. Most acquisitions would be shipped separately. One small volume, too precious to risk in a trunk, he would carry himself. The world of collectors revolves around preservation, but preservation requires survival. Harry could not know that his library would never grow beyond that spring. He could not know that the institution he imagined would one day exist, built by his mother in his name, without him. For now, he boarded ships with excitement. The Atlantic lay calm, and in his luggage, carefully wrapped, lay centuries of ink waiting to cross the ocean once more. Collecting, at its highest level, is rarely quiet. It is conducted in hushed rooms, yes, auction houses thick with anticipation, dealers' shops lined with polished wood and glass. But beneath the surface runs something sharper than appreciation: competition. By the early 20th century, a transatlantic rivalry had formed among America's wealthiest collectors. Rail magnates, steel industrialists, financiers, men who had conquered markets, now turned their ambition toward culture. Paintings, manuscripts, first editions. Europe was selling. Aristocratic families burdened by taxation and shifting economies were quietly dispersing libraries accumulated over centuries. Auction catalogues grew thicker. Dealers moved carefully between estates and American clients. For Harry Elkins Widener, these auctions were not mere transactions. They were contests of knowledge. He did not yet possess the financial reach of older titans, but he had precision. He studied catalogues line by line. He traced provenance histories. He learned which bindings signalled authenticity and which suggested restoration. In London, sales of major private libraries drew international attention. The Huth sale, the dispersal of Alfred Henry Huth's celebrated collection, electrified serious bibliophiles. Rare volumes emerged from storage into competitive bidding. Harry travelled determined. He had been outbid before, most notably by Henry Huntington, the California Railroad magnate whose appetite for rare books rivaled any collector in America. Huntington possessed deeper pockets and a willingness to drive prices upward without hesitation. Harry possessed restraint. He chose his targets carefully. At Bernard Quaritch's bookshop on Grafton Street, the air felt dense with paper and history. Leather spines lined shelves. Catalogues lay stacked across polished counters. Conversations occurred in low tones, each word measured. Here Harry examined volumes recently acquired from the Huth collection. There were multi-volume sets, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in refined bindings, original Dickens illustrations, early English texts preserved through centuries of ownership, and then a small book, Francis Bacon's Essays, 2nd edition, printed in 1598. It was not large. It did not command a wall like a painting. But its importance lay in proximity to origin, an early imprint of a thinker whose words shaped intellectual history. Harry held it gently. 4 centuries old. Pages slightly browned with time, type impressed into paper when printing was still young in England. He purchased it for £260. Other acquisitions would be shipped home carefully in protective trunks. Insurance documents prepared, routes planned. This one he kept. He joked lightly, if he were ever shipwrecked, at least he would have something to read. Rivalry sharpened his collecting instinct, but it did not harden his temperament. Dealers described him as courteous, thoughtful, deliberate. He did not raise paddles impulsively. He bid with clarity. He sought coherence in his collection, not sheer volume. Each purchase felt like a brick laid in a future institution. He imagined a building dedicated entirely to rare volumes, controlled light, quiet tables, scholars turning pages carefully. A library bearing his vision. His mother encouraged the idea. His grandfather admired it. Within Linwood Hall, shelves were already filling, but the Atlantic called again. Spring of 1912, business in Paris concluded, London purchases secured. Passage arranged for return to New York aboard a vessel attracting attention across Europe, the Titanic. Among passengers boarding in April were magnates, aristocrats, newlyweds, emigrants, and one young collector carrying a small leather-bound volume in his pocket. Auctions reward timing, but fate rarely announces its closing bid. Harry had competed successfully in London's rarefied rooms. He could not compete with ice drifting in the North Atlantic. The contest he entered next would not allow negotiation, and the small book he carried would vanish into darkness without record. But for now he boarded with quiet confidence, his purchases secured, his rivals momentarily behind him. The sea lay calm, and the Atlantic seemed simply another route to cross. Collecting, at its highest level, is rarely quiet. It is conducted in hushed rooms, yes, auction houses thick with anticipation, dealers' shops lined with polished wood and glass, but beneath the surface runs something sharper than appreciation: competition. By the early 20th century, a transatlantic rivalry had formed among America's wealthiest collectors. Rail magnates, steel industrialists, financiers, men who had conquered markets, now turned their ambition toward culture. Paintings, manuscripts, first editions. Europe was selling. Aristocratic families burdened by taxation and shifting economies were quietly dispersing libraries accumulated over centuries. Auction catalogues grew thicker. Dealers moved carefully between estates and American clients. For Harry Elkins Widener, these auctions were not mere transactions. They were contests of knowledge. He did not yet possess the financial reach of older titans, but he had precision. He studied catalogues line by line. He traced provenance histories. He learned which bindings signalled authenticity and which suggested restoration. In London, sales of major private libraries drew international attention. The Huth sale, the dispersal of Alfred Henry Huth's celebrated collection, electrified serious bibliophiles. Rare volumes emerged from storage into competitive bidding. Harry travelled determined. He had been outbid before, most notably by Henry Huntington, the California Railroad magnate whose appetite for rare books rivaled any collector in America. Huntington possessed deeper pockets and a willingness to drive prices upward without hesitation. Harry possessed restraint. He chose his targets carefully. At Bernard Quaritch's bookshop on Grafton Street, the air felt dense with paper and history. Leather spines lined shelves. Catalogues lay stacked across polished counters. Conversations occurred in low tones, each word measured. Here Harry examined volumes recently acquired from the Huth collection. There were multi-volume sets, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in refined bindings, original Dickens illustrations, early English texts preserved through centuries of ownership, and then a small book, Francis Bacon's Essays, 2nd edition, printed in 1598. It was not large. It did not command a wall like a painting, but its importance lay in proximity to origin, an early imprint of a thinker whose words shaped intellectual history. Harry held it gently. 4 centuries old. Pages slightly browned with time, type impressed into paper when printing was still young in England. He purchased it for £260. Other acquisitions would be shipped home carefully in protective trunks. Insurance documents prepared, routes planned. This one he kept. He joked lightly, if he were ever shipwrecked, at least he would have something to read. Rivalry sharpened his collecting instinct, but it did not harden his temperament. Dealers described him as courteous, thoughtful, deliberate. He did not raise paddles impulsively. He bid with clarity. He sought coherence in his collection, not sheer volume. Each purchase felt like a brick laid in a future institution. He imagined a building dedicated entirely to rare volumes, controlled light, quiet tables, scholars turning pages carefully. A library bearing his vision. His mother encouraged the idea. His grandfather admired it. Within Linwood Hall, shelves were already filling, but the Atlantic called again. Spring of 1912, Business in Paris concluded. London purchases secured. Passage arranged for return to New York aboard a vessel attracting attention across Europe, the Titanic. Among passengers boarding in April were magnates, aristocrats, newlyweds, emigrants, and one young collector carrying a small leather-bound volume in his pocket. Auctions reward timing, but fate rarely announces its closing bid. Harry had competed successfully in London's rarefied rooms. He could not compete with ice drifting in the North Atlantic. The contest he entered next would not allow negotiation, and the small book he carried would vanish into darkness without record. But for now he boarded with quiet confidence, his purchases secured, his rivals momentarily behind him. The sea lay calm, and the Atlantic seemed simply another route to cross. Southampton, April 10th, 1912. The docks were alive long before noon. Porters hurried between stacks of luggage. Steam drifted upward from funnels already warm. Passengers gathered in clusters, some anxious, some exhilarated, all aware they were about to board something unprecedented. The Titanic did not merely sit at the pier, it towered. 882 feet of steel and symmetry. 4 massive funnels rising above layered decks. Windows aligned in disciplined rows. Even at rest, it projected movement. Newspapers had described it as the largest moving object ever built by human hands. Visitors along the quay craned their necks upward. The ship did not appear fragile. It appeared permanent. Harry Elkins Widener arrived with his parents, George and Eleanor. Their first-class passage placed them among the most distinguished travellers aboard. The Widener name carried recognition in financial circles, and the White Star Line treated its elite passengers accordingly. Their accommodations were on sea deck, adjoining cabins designed for comfort rather than extravagance, though even comfort on Titanic surpassed most hotels of the era. Polished wood panelling, upholstered seating, electric lighting, running water. Servants attended them, George's valet, Eleanor's maid. The embarkation itself felt orderly, almost ceremonial. Passengers crossed gangways with tickets in gloved hands. Stewards guided them through corridors that smelled faintly of fresh paint and polished brass. The grand staircase, illuminated beneath a glass dome, drew immediate admiration. Its carved balustrades curved with architectural confidence. Harry paused there briefly. He had seen marble halls grander at Linwood, but the novelty of steel transformed into elegance intrigued him. This was modern opulence. Not inherited stone, but engineered comfort. Above deck, promenades stretched outward, inviting passengers to stroll and survey the harbour. Southampton receded gradually as tugs assisted Titanic away from shore. Crowds waved from the quay. No one imagined they were witnessing a departure that would become immortal. The first hours unfolded gently. Luggage was unpacked, cabins arranged. Passengers explored salons, libraries, smoking rooms. The first-class restaurant promised refinement equal to the finest establishments in London or New York. Among those aboard were names recognisable across continents: John Jacob Astor and his young wife, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, industrialists, aristocrats, entrepreneurs. The Titanic had become a floating society. Harry carried with him the small Bacon volume purchased in London. Most of his acquisitions travelled separately, insured and secured. This one remained close. Perhaps he placed it in a drawer beside his berth. Perhaps he kept it within his coat. The detail would vanish into uncertainty. The ship stopped briefly at Cherbourg and Queenstown, collecting additional passengers. Then she turned westward fully toward open Atlantic. The sea lay calm, the sky clear. Life aboard quickly adopted rhythm. Morning promenades, afternoon reading in the lounge, conversations over tea, evenings of formal dress and orchestrated dinners. Harry moved comfortably among the first-class circle. He was young compared to many, but well accustomed to wealth and restraint. His father conducted conversations about finance. His mother observed society with measured composure. The Titanic moved steadily, engines humming beneath decks. Each day carried them farther from Europe, closer to New York. Confidence surrounded them. The ship's design included watertight compartments intended to prevent catastrophic flooding. Engineers spoke proudly of its safety features. Crew members conveyed assurance through routine. The Atlantic in those early days seemed almost cooperative, blue by day, starlit by night. Harry had crossed oceans before. The voyage felt familiar, almost leisurely. In less than a week, they would step back into Philadelphia society. The Bacon volume would join shelves at Linwood. Plans for future acquisitions would continue. Everything appeared aligned. But the ocean measures time differently. Beneath its surface, far north, ice had broken free from Greenland's glaciers months earlier. Currents carried fragments southward silently. Steel and rivets cannot negotiate with frozen water. For now, Titanic advanced smoothly, slicing through calm seas with the assurance of modern engineering. Passengers dined, music played, and somewhere ahead, unseen in darkness yet to fall, something waited. Sunday, April the 14th, 1912. By the fourth evening at sea, life aboard the Titanic had settled into elegance. The Atlantic remained calm, unusually calm. The surface lay almost polished, reflecting a sky that would soon darken into moonless black. The temperature had dropped steadily throughout the day, though few in first class felt discomfort inside heated salons. The Widener family prepared for dinner. Formal attire was expected, coats tailored, dresses selected with care. The first-class restaurant promised an experience that rivaled London's finest establishments. White linen, silver cutlery, crystal glasses aligned with geometric precision. That evening, George and Eleanor Widener hosted a dinner in honour of Captain Edward John Smith. Smith was nearing retirement. He had commanded transatlantic liners for decades and was widely respected. The White Star Line had entrusted him with the maiden voyage of its newest and most magnificent ship, a final tribute before leaving the sea. The guest list reflected wealth and prominence, industrialists, financiers, social elites, men accustomed to being addressed by title and position. Harry sat among them, young, composed, observant. The courses arrived one by one: oysters, consommé, salmon with mousseline sauce, filet mignon, roast squab, desserts arranged like small sculptures. Conversation flowed easily between politics, markets, and travel. Captain Smith was gracious, confident. He spoke of the voyage as routine. The weather had been favourable, the crossing smooth. Outside, wireless operators had received multiple ice warnings throughout the day from other ships travelling the North Atlantic. Messages reported fields of dummies and drifting bergs farther west. Inside the restaurant, none of that tension surfaced. Music drifted faintly through corridors. Laughter punctuated table talk. Servants moved with discreet efficiency, refilling glasses, clearing plates. Harry perhaps thought of the books waiting for him at home. The Bacon volume secured nearby. The next auction he might attend. The library he imagined building one day. It was an ordinary evening, elevated by luxury. Dinner concluded around 10:30 p.m. Guests dispersed gradually. Some retired early. Others moved to the smoking room for cigars and cards. The air outside had grown colder still, but the sea remained unnaturally flat. A calm ocean can be deceptive. Without waves breaking against ice, the white edges of drifting bergs become harder to detect in darkness. Shortly before midnight, Titanic continued westward at nearly full speed. The temperature hovered near freezing. The stars shone brilliantly above. Harry returned toward his cabin on sea deck. Perhaps he paused at the grand staircase once more. Perhaps he passed through the promenade where windows reflected his silhouette faintly against night. There was no sense of urgency. The ship had sailed smoothly for days. Confidence in its design bordered on faith. The phrase "practically unsinkable" circulated casually among passengers. At 11:40 p.m, the calm would break. But for now, April 14th remained a polished evening of silverware and certainty. The Widener family had hosted a final dinner without knowing it was final. Captain Smith had accepted congratulations for a voyage nearing completion. The Atlantic lay silent beyond the hull, and somewhere ahead, an iceberg drifted unseen in the dark, indifferent to titles, fortunes, and farewell dinners. At 11:40 p.m, the night split quietly. The lookout in the crow's nest rang the bell 3 times. Iceberg, right ahead. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch reacted instantly. Engines ordered to reverse. Helm turned hard to port. The massive ship responded, but slowly. Steel does not pivot like thought. For 37 seconds, Titanic attempted to alter her path. It was not enough. The iceberg did not strike the ship head-on. It brushed her starboard side. A long, tearing scrape beneath the waterline. Plates buckled. Rivets popped. Seawater entered compartments not designed to flood together. Above deck, the sensation was subtle. Passengers felt a tremor, a long shudder like distant thunder travelling through steel. Some thought the ship had thrown a propeller blade, others barely noticed. In first class, conversations paused briefly, then resumed. In the lower decks, crew members felt something different. Water rushed into the forward compartments, cold, relentless, unstoppable. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, descended to assess the damage. He moved methodically, calculating the ship's tolerance. 4 compartments could flood and Titanic would remain afloat. 6 were compromised. The mathematics were merciless. Titanic would sink. The estimate varied. 2 hours, perhaps less. Upstairs, calm persisted. Passengers were told to don lifebelts as a precaution. The air had grown sharply colder. Breath formed faint clouds against night. Harry Widener likely felt the shift from curiosity to unease. He would have known enough about engineering to understand that precautions were rarely arbitrary. The decks tilted almost imperceptibly. The engines fell silent. Around midnight, crew began uncovering lifeboats. The ship carried far fewer boats than passengers, not illegal by regulations of the time, but insufficient for full evacuation. Most were designed to transfer passengers to rescue vessels in open water, not to serve as independent survival craft. Women and children first. The order moved quietly through the decks. George and Eleanor made their way toward the boat deck with Harry beside them. Stewards directed first-class passengers toward the port side. The night was black. There was no moon. The sea lay flat, a sheet of dark glass. Ice warnings had been received earlier in the day, but the water remained deceptively calm, no waves breaking against bergs to reveal their outlines. Confusion mingled with disbelief. Many passengers hesitated. The lifeboats appeared small compared to the vast hull rising above them. Some refused to leave the warmth of the ship for wooden boats suspended 70 feet above freezing water. Titanic did not look like a dying vessel. She looked immense, illuminated, solid. Harry stood near his parents as preparations continued. Eleanor's maid remained close. George's valet assisted where needed. The tilt increased gradually. Water crept forward beneath decks unseen. Below, stokers and engineers worked in rising cold, keeping lights burning as long as possible. Electricity still flowed. The grand staircase remained illuminated. The orchestra assembled on deck and began to play. Music carried into the night. Light, controlled, unreal. Time compressed. Lifeboats lowered one by one, some partially filled as disbelief slowed decision. Harry watched as his mother was urged toward lifeboat number 4. There was still hope that Titanic might remain afloat long enough for assistance to arrive. Wireless distress calls had already been sent. CQD SOS. But the nearest responding ship was hours away. The impact had been quiet. The consequences would not be. The bow sank deeper into black water, and the illusion of unsinkability began to dissolve. By 1:30 a.m., the slope was undeniable. Passengers walking forward felt the deck incline beneath polished shoes. Crockery shifted in cupboards below. Water crept silently through compartments designed to delay, not prevent, catastrophe. On the port side, lifeboat number 4 hung suspended, its ropes taut, its wooden frame stark against the black sea. The loading had been delayed. Titanic's enclosed promenade windows needed to be opened to allow access. Minutes were lost to mechanics and uncertainty. Time, measured earlier in estimates, was now measured in seconds. Eleanor Widener stood with her husband and son near the rail. She was 50 years old. She had crossed the Atlantic many times. She was accustomed to luxury, to calm decision-making, to trust in systems built by men like her father and father-in-law. But systems were failing. Second Officer Lightoller supervised loading on that side of the ship. His instructions were firm, women and children first. There was hesitation. Some women refused to enter the boat without their husbands. The scale of the ship made danger feel distant. Titanic still glowed with electric light. The band continued to play. George and Harry assisted Eleanor toward the lifeboat. Her maid, Emily, followed close behind. Accounts later described the moment in fragments. Gloved hands gripping the rail, the cold biting sharply, breath visible in the air. The water below was nearly black, absorbing starlight without reflection. Eleanor hesitated. Leaving meant separation. Remaining meant uncertainty. George reassured her. Harry stood beside him. 27 years old, slight in build, composed. He had time to step forward. Other boats remained. A friend, William Carter, urged him to secure a place in one of them. Harry declined. "I think I will stick to the big ship, Billy, and take a chance." Whether the words were exactly recorded or softened by memory later hardly matters. The sentiment was clear. He would remain with his father. The boat lowered slowly. Ropes creaked. The hull loomed above as Eleanor descended toward the water. She looked upward. 2 figures remained at the rail. Husband and son framed against electric light. It would be the last time she saw them. Lifeboat number 4 touched the Atlantic around 1:50 a.m. Rowers pushed away carefully, avoiding suction against the ship's hull. The oars dipped into water only a few degrees above freezing. From below, Titanic appeared even larger, a wall of steel rising into darkness. The bow sank steadily. Lifeboats drifted outward to avoid being pulled under. Passengers in them watched as the ship's angle increased. The lights flickered. Music continued, faint and surreal. At approximately 2:20 a.m., Titanic's stern lifted high into the sky. Machinery groaned within her frame. A sound like tearing metal carried across the still ocean. Then the ship broke. The forward section slipped beneath the surface first. The stern remained suspended briefly before following. The lights went out. In the lifeboats, silence fell, followed by cries. Hundreds of voices in freezing water, calling for help that could not reach them in time. The cries diminished gradually. The sea closed. Eleanor sat among strangers, wrapped in layers insufficient against cold and shock. She stared at darkness where her family had stood moments earlier. Harry had carried a small book aboard, an early edition of Francis Bacon's essays. If it remained in his pocket, it descended with him. Paper, leather, ink, all surrendered to salt water. At dawn, the Carpathia would arrive to rescue survivors. George and Harry Widener would not be among them. Lifeboat number 4 drifted beneath paling stars, carrying a widow toward a world forever altered. The ship built by confidence lay in fragments 2 miles below, and the sea, indifferent, returned to calm. Dawn came slowly, not with brilliance, but with a pale, exhausted light spreading across a horizon that revealed nothing of the night's violence. The Atlantic appeared calm again, indifferent, almost innocent. Lifeboats drifted in scattered clusters. In lifeboat number 4, Eleanor Widener sat wrapped in borrowed coats, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on the place where the Titanic had disappeared. Around her, survivors spoke in fragments, half-sentences, disbelief, prayer. The cries from the water had faded hours earlier. Cold had done what steel could not. Shortly after 4 a.m., the lights of the RMS Carpathia appeared in the distance. She had turned hard through fields of ice after receiving Titanic's distress signals. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, pushed engines beyond routine limits, racing through darkness toward coordinates transmitted in Morse code. When Carpathia reached the lifeboats, her crew worked in silence and urgency. Ropes lowered, blankets distributed. Survivors lifted aboard one by one. Eleanor climbed the ladder slowly. She had boarded Titanic with husband and son beside her. She stepped onto Carpathia alone. The deck felt solid beneath her feet, yet unreal. Steam rose from soaked clothing. Crew members guided the rescued toward heated spaces. Some collapsed. Some wept openly. Others remained still, suspended in shock. Lists began forming immediately, names of the saved, names of the missing. In the hours that followed, Carpathia circled the area cautiously, searching for additional lifeboats. Icebergs drifted nearby, pale blue in daylight, massive and silent. There was no sign of Titanic, no floating hull, no scattered debris beyond chairs and fragments of wood. More than 1,500 people had entered the water. Few bodies surfaced long enough to be identified. Later recovery ships would retrieve some, but the majority were claimed permanently. George Dunton Widener, Harry Elkins Widener. No remains returned. Eleanor spent the crossing back to New York in a cabin assigned for privacy. She answered inquiries from officials as required. She described the dinner with Captain Smith, the lifeboat loading, the final sight of her husband and son. Her words were composed, factual. the weight beneath them immeasurable. When Carpathia docked in New York on April 18, 1912, rain fell. Crowds gathered in silence rather than celebration. Newspapers shouted headlines that would echo for decades. Unsinkable. Lost. 1,500 dead. Eleanor did not remain in New York long. Arrangements were made for a private train to Philadelphia. The journey home felt longer than the Atlantic crossing. At Linwood Hall, a telegram had already arrived days earlier. Peter Arrol Brown Widener had read it alone. His son, his grandson, gone. When Eleanor entered the front hall of the mansion, the space seemed altered. Marble columns remained. Paintings hung undisturbed. The staircase curved upward as it always had. But two voices would never echo there again. Memorial services followed at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Elkins Park. Stained glass windows would later commemorate George and Harry. Names inscribed in stone in place of bodies that the ocean refused to surrender. Harry's small Bacon volume, the one he had carried aboard, vanished into the Atlantic with him. Books are built to endure centuries. Water dissolves them in moments. The sea keeps its dead. It keeps their possessions. It keeps their stories until others choose to tell them. For Peter Widener, the disaster was not an abstract tragedy reported in newspapers. It was personal. He had invested in systems. He had trusted engineering. He had built in stone to defy time. Now the ocean had taken 2 generations. The mansion that symbolized permanence felt suddenly fragile. But grief in the Widener family would not remain silent. It would be translated into brick, into marble, into institutions that would stand long after the Atlantic had grown quiet again. The telegram arrived at Linwood Hall on the morning of April 16, 1912. It was brief. Telegrams always were. There was no space for softness, no room for hesitation. Only information compressed into blunt sentences. Titanic sunk. George and Harry missing. No confirmation of survival. Peter Arrol Brown. Widener was 77 years old when he read those words. He had built empires from fragments. He had consolidated rail lines, negotiated contracts, invested across industries. He had outlived financial panics and political shifts. He had survived the death of his wife and the earlier loss of his eldest son. But this was different. This was not illness or accident confined to one generation. This was erasure. His son, George, the steady heir who managed business affairs, his grandson, Harry, the collector who dreamed of libraries, both gone in one night. The mansion around him did not change physically. Marble columns stood as they had the day before. Paintings remained secured in gilded frames. The gardens outside followed geometric design untouched by news from the Atlantic. Yet the air felt altered. Servants moved more quietly than usual. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms. The silence expanded rather than receded. When Eleanor returned days later, he met her in the entrance hall. The embrace was brief and formal, a shared recognition of absence rather than demonstrative grief. The family was not prone to spectacle, but those present remembered the stillness. 2 of the 3 Widener men were gone. There would be no funerals with caskets, no final viewing. The Atlantic had claimed the bodies. Memorial services at St. Paul's Episcopal Church offered ritual in place of remains, names spoken aloud, hymns sung. Stained glass commissioned later to capture memory in coloured light. Peter's health began to decline soon after. Physicians attributed it to age and diabetes. Newspapers noted exhaustion. Friends observed something less clinical. Energy faded. The ballroom that had once hosted orchestras fell silent. Summer openings of the galleries continued, but without the same vigour. Peter wandered rooms alone more often, pausing before canvases that had survived centuries of war and revolution. Art endured. Family did not. He had built Linwood Hall to secure continuity after his wife's death. He had imagined sons and grandsons inhabiting it long after he was gone. Now continuity fractured. Joseph, his younger son, assumed greater responsibility for the family's affairs. The art collection, already refined, became his domain more fully. Joseph approached it with scholarly precision, separating the essential from the merely impressive. Peter observed quietly. He no longer expanded. He preserved. The sea that had carried his investments across continents now represented something else entirely. Irony weighed heavily. Through the International Mercantile Marine Company, he had invested in White Star. Titanic was part of that corporate system. Steel, financed by men like him, had formed her hull. The ship was both asset and instrument. Now it was grave. Peter lived 3.5 years after the disaster. He did not publicly dramatize his grief. He attended to business as required. He maintained appearances. But those close to him noted a withdrawal, a narrowing of ambition. He had conquered systems. He could not conquer the ocean. When he died in November 1915 at Linwood Hall, the official cause was listed as old age. The deeper cause needed no notation. His body lay in state in the Van Dyck Gallery, beneath the gaze of portraits he had collected. Visitors filed past in quiet lines. He was buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery beside his wife. His estate, valued at tens of millions, remained structured to endure for decades. Trusts established, holdings protected. But wealth could not restore what the Atlantic had taken. In the aftermath of his death, the responsibility for legacy shifted fully to those who remained. Eleanor, Joseph. They would respond differently to grief. Peter had answered loss with stone. His daughter-in-law would answer it with something larger still. Grief does not always collapse inward. Sometimes it builds. Within weeks of returning from New York in April 1912, Eleanor Elkins Widener began to consider what her son would have wanted. Harry had spoken often of a library. Not a private room within Linwood Hall, but a dedicated institution. A building designed for rare books, proper light, proper preservation. Space for scholars to sit in silence and turn fragile pages without fear. He had imagined it abstractly. Eleanor would make it concrete. Harvard was the natural choice. It was Harry's alma mater. It was also a university whose existing library, Gore Hall, had long outgrown its capacity. Shelves were overcrowded. Additions had been improvised awkwardly. The building no longer suited the scale of its collection. Eleanor contacted Harvard's president, Abbot Lawrence Lowell. Her offer was direct. She would not merely donate Harry's books, she would finance an entirely new library. The scale astonished administrators. The projected cost exceeded $2 million, eventually rising above $3.5 million. It would become the largest private gift in the university's history. Architecture once again entered the family story. Horace Trumbauer, the architect of Linwood Hall, was commissioned to design the building. The project's principal designer was Julian Abel, a brilliant architect working within Trumbauer's firm. Abel's role, though not fully acknowledged at the time, would shape the structure's enduring form. Construction began in 1913. Gore Hall was demolished to make space. 50,000 bricks were laid daily during peak construction. The design followed a Beaux-Arts aesthetic, restrained but monumental. Red brick and Indiana limestone created a facade both dignified and durable. At its heart would stand the memorial rooms. These chambers were designed specifically to house Harry's collection. Custom shelving, controlled light, portrait placement calculated carefully. Eleanor insisted upon precision. On June 24th, 1915, commencement day, the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library was dedicated. Eleanor ascended its broad steps beside President Lowell and other dignitaries. A portrait of her son was unveiled. Speeches framed the building as a triumph of philanthropy and resilience. Inside, one of the first volumes formally carried into the new structure was a 17th century theological text, believed to have belonged to John Harvard himself. Symbolism layered upon symbolism. Harry's books would now join centuries of academic inheritance. Eleanor imposed conditions upon the gift. The building's exterior could never be altered. Its purpose would remain permanent. The memorial rooms were to be preserved exactly as she designed them. Fresh flowers were to be placed beside Harry's portrait. They remain there to this day. Legends later grew around the donation, most famously the claim that Eleanor required Harvard to mandate swimming lessons in memory of her son's death at sea. The story proved untrue. No such stipulation existed. The truth was simpler. She had built a monument. Stone in Cambridge answered water in the Atlantic. Widener Library became the intellectual heart of Harvard University. Over time, its stacks would expand underground, forming a labyrinth of shelves stretching miles beneath Harvard Yard. Students would study there who had never heard of the Titanic in detail. Scholars would request volumes without realizing the grief embedded in the building's origin. Eleanor had transformed private loss into public inheritance. Her son's dream of a library, once imagined abstractly, now stood in brick and limestone. Harry had collected books to preserve thought. His mother preserved him in architecture. The Atlantic kept his body, Harvard kept his name. Eleanor Elkins Widener could have remained still. After 1912, no one would have questioned retreat. Society expected it. A widow who had lost both husband and son in a single night was permitted silence, permitted withdrawal, permitted a life defined by memorial alone. But Eleanor did not choose stillness. On October 6, 1915, only months after the dedication of Widener Library and shortly before Peter Widener's death, she remarried. Her new husband was Alexander Hamilton Rice. Rice was not an industrialist. He was a surgeon and an explorer. A Harvard graduate with a taste for remote frontiers, he had already gained recognition for expeditions into South America's interior. The pairing surprised some observers. The widow of a traction magnate marrying a man whose life revolved around rivers and jungle. But Eleanor seemed drawn toward motion. Perhaps stillness felt unbearable. She had built in stone for her son. Now she turned toward movement for herself. Before the marriage, she completed Miramar, a 30,000 square foot mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. The estate had originally been planned with her late husband George before the Titanic voyage. Construction continued after his death. When Miramar opened, it did so with spectacle. 500 guests attended its inaugural ball, diplomats, socialites, industrial heirs. The widow had not retreated into shadow. She had built another palace, yet Miramar was not her final stage. In 1916, Eleanor sailed aboard the yacht Alberta with her new husband on an expedition to the Amazon basin. The shift from marble halls to humid jungle was stark. Steamships gave way to smaller vessels navigating winding rivers. Heat replaced Atlantic cold. Dense foliage replaced formal gardens. Rice pursued exploration with scientific rigor. He used early aerial photography to map previously undocumented regions. Eleanor did not remain confined to comfortable quarters. She travelled deep into territory unfamiliar to most Americans. Newspapers followed the expeditions closely. Headlines oscillated between admiration and exaggeration. Stories circulated of encounters with indigenous groups, of illness and danger narrowly avoided. One expedition briefly lost contact with the outside world, prompting rumours, including sensational claims that Rice had been captured or killed. He had not. They returned. Eleanor's presence in these ventures fascinated society reporters. A woman in her 50s and 60s, previously defined by high society and philanthropy, now navigating rivers few outsiders had seen. Perhaps the Amazon's relentless movement appealed to her. Rivers do not pause. They carve forward, reshaping terrain quietly over time. In 1929, she and Rice founded Harvard's Institute of Geographical Exploration. Eleanor provided endowment funds. Rice directed research. The institution advanced photogrammetry, the science of creating maps from aerial photographs, mapping, charting unknown spaces, bringing order to wilderness. It echoed earlier family themes, systematizing movement, organizing knowledge. Eleanor divided her time between Newport, New York, Paris, and South America. Travel replaced mourning as routine. Her life expanded outward rather than narrowing inward. She had stood in a lifeboat watching steel vanish into darkness. She refused to let that night define every horizon afterward. On July 13th, 1937, she died suddenly of a heart attack while shopping in Paris. She was 75. Her body returned to Philadelphia. She was interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery beside empty markers commemorating George and Harry, whose remains the ocean had never yielded. Her crypt did not dramatize the Titanic. It did not need to. The library stood in Cambridge. The expeditions mapped rivers. The life she built after tragedy stood as its own monument. Eleanor had answered water with stone, then she answered stone with motion. The Atlantic had taken her family. She chose not to remain anchored to its memory. After Peter Widener's death in 1915, the responsibility for the art collection passed fully to Joseph Widener. Unlike his father, Joseph did not build empires of rails or invest in shipping trusts. His focus narrowed deliberately toward culture. Where Peter had accumulated widely, Joseph refined. He sold lesser works. He upgraded selectively. He pursued coherence over quantity. By the late 1930s, the once vast Linwood collection had been distilled into roughly 100 paintings considered among the finest examples available in private hands. 14 Rembrandts, multiple Van Dycks, Raphael's small Cowper Madonna, Vermeer's Woman, holding a balance Bellini, Titian, Gainsborough, Reynolds. Each canvas carried centuries of history. Each had survived wars, revolutions, and aristocratic decline. Linwood Hall remained open to the public during summer months. Visitors walked through galleries where soft music sometimes drifted faintly from hidden speakers. Chairs invited reflection. The arrangement felt less like private indulgence and more like a transitional museum. Joseph understood something his father had begun to sense. Private collections do not last forever. Families disperse, estates divide. Markets shift, institutions endure. In Washington, a new institution was emerging. The National Gallery of Art, established through Andrew Mellon's bequest, sought to assemble a collection worthy of the nation. Its architecture promised permanence, its mission aligned with Joseph's evolving vision. Negotiations began quietly. Joseph offered not a single masterpiece, but the core of the Widener collection. The transfer required legislative action. Federal law needed adjustment to accommodate the tax implications of such a gift. Congress passed the necessary provisions in 1942. That year, Joseph donated more than 2,000 works, paintings, sculpture, decorative arts, and Chinese porcelain, to the National Gallery. The impact was immediate. The gallery's holdings in Dutch painting more than doubled overnight. Raphael's luminous Madonna entered public display. Rembrandt's shadowed landscapes found new walls. The Widener name became inseparable from Washington's artistic identity. The private palace's treasures became public inheritance. Joseph did not long outlive the donation. He died in October 1943 at Linwood Hall. The galleries that once glowed with masterpieces stood suddenly empty. The marble remained, the velvet wall coverings, the architectural precision, but the paintings were gone. They hung now in Washington, where millions would see them. The Widener legacy had shifted from private magnificence to national stewardship. One final gesture remained. Years earlier, Peter Widener had purchased a Gutenberg Bible while his grandson Harry travelled abroad. He intended it as a surprise, a gift for the young collector whose passion for rare volumes had grown steadily. Harry learned of the purchase, but not the intention. The Titanic intervened. After Peter's death, the Bible passed through family hands. In 1944, Harry's siblings, George Widener Jr. and Eleanor Widener Dixon, donated it to Harvard's Widener Library. It belonged there. The butcher's grandson who dreamed of a library would now have one of the world's rarest books resting within its memorial rooms. Only 23 complete Gutenberg Bibles survive. One stands beneath Harry's portrait in Cambridge. Fresh flowers continue to appear beside it. Art once hung in private halls. Books once rested in personal shelves. Now both reside in public institutions. The Atlantic kept its dead. The Wideners gave their treasures away, and the nation inherited what tragedy could not erase. The paintings left first, then the family, then, slowly, everything else. After Joseph Widener's death in 1943, Linwood Hall entered a quieter chapter. Without the art that had animated its galleries, the mansion felt suspended between memory and uncertainty. Marble columns still held their weight. The grand staircase still curved upward with theatrical grace. But the walls that once displayed Rembrandt and Raphael now stood bare. The southern portions of the estate were sold for development. Land that had once belonged to a single vision fractured into parcels. Streets cut through former gardens. Houses rose where open lawns had stretched toward tree lines. The mansion itself changed hands. In 1952, Faith Theological Seminary purchased Linwood Hall for a fraction of its original cost, less than $200,000. Students of theology studied beneath ceilings painted for orchestras. Classrooms formed within rooms once designed for aristocratic portraits. For decades, the building adapted. But adaptation came at a price. Maintenance of such scale was costly. As finances tightened, architectural elements were removed and sold. Imported panelling disappeared, antique fixtures were stripped, furniture long associated with European lineage scattered into private collections. By the 1990s, the seminary departed. Another buyer acquired the property at sheriff's sale. Plans were proposed. Churches, schools, redevelopment schemes, none realized fully. The American Versailles fell silent. Windows broke, roofs leaked. Plaster peeled from ceilings that had once shimmered beneath chandeliers. Gardens surrendered to weeds and encroaching forest. Ivy climbed limestone walls. Time did what fire and war had never done. It neglected. Photographs circulated online of abandoned ballrooms, of marble staircases gathering dust. Preservationists whispered anxiously. Developers expressed interest in demolition. Subdivision seemed inevitable. The butcher's son had built for permanence. Impermanence crept in quietly. Then, in the early 21st century, a small group of preservation advocates began visiting the property. They studied architectural drawings. They assessed structural integrity. They believed restoration remained possible. In 2023, after years of negotiation, Linwood Hall was sold for $9 million to a preservation foundation committed to rehabilitation. The project was immense: asbestos removal, structural stabilization, roof repair, restoration of 34 acres of grounds. Funding required not in thousands but millions annually. Yet the bones remained strong. Indiana limestone does not surrender easily. Foundations laid deep in 1897 still held. Proportions designed by Horace Trumbauer still commanded attention. In 2025, Linwood Hall was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Plans were announced to reopen the mansion to the public once again, as an educational and cultural centre. Gardens would be restored as community spaces. Apprentices would learn preservation trades within its walls. The house that once displayed private masterpieces might display art again. The marble halls that once echoed with absence might echo with voices once more. The Widener story circles back to stone. Peter Widener built Linwood Hall after losing his wife, an assertion that legacy could defy time. The Atlantic later claimed his son and grandson. Eleanor answered that loss with a library in Cambridge. Joseph answered with paintings in Washington. And the mansion, emptied, stripped, nearly forgotten, refused to disappear. The butcher's son is not remembered for mutton contracts or traction franchises. He is remembered for monuments, a library at Harvard, masterpieces at the National Gallery, and a palace in Pennsylvania that survived neglect and returned from silence. The sea kept its dead. The Wideners built in response, and long after the Titanic settled into darkness 2 miles below the Atlantic, brick and limestone continue to stand, holding memory where water could not.